Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services virtual public meeting for the Gopher Tortoise. We're going to give folks a few minutes here to join the webinar, and then we will begin the PowerPoint presentation shortly, so please stay tuned. I do want to note that closed captioning is available by selecting the closed caption icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen if you're using the Zoom web portal or Zoom app on your computer. Again, welcome everyone to tonight's meeting. We're going to give folks a few more minutes to join the meeting, so please stay tuned and we will start the presentation shortly. Again, I do want to note that the closed captioning is available by selecting the closed caption icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen if you are using the Zoom web portal or Zoom app on your computer. All right, with that, we'll go ahead and get started with our webinar tonight. On behalf of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, I would like to thank you all for joining us. We appreciate your time and participation. My name is Megan Stone with Environmental Management and Planning Solutions, Inc., a contractor for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I'm going to be one of your meeting facilitators tonight. Additionally, I have several members of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service with me on the meeting tonight who will be answering your questions. They will introduce themselves later on. So our expected agenda for the meeting tonight is up on the screen. I will first go over some brief ground rules for tonight's meeting. The USFWS will provide introductions and a PowerPoint presentation. For the remainder of the webinar, the USFWS will answer any questions you may have about the Gopher Tortoise during a question and answer session. And we're going to go through the questions submitted through registration first. And if time allows, we'll move on to any live questions. To be clear, the service has several subject matter experts available to answer questions during the Q&A portion of the meeting. However, this meeting will not include a public comment portion. After the question and answer session, the service will provide some closing remarks. So before we begin with the presentation, I'm going to go over some ground rules for the meeting. First, this meeting is being recorded as part of the project record, and a recording will be posted to the USFWS website. We put that link in the chat for you guys. Second, your microphones and videos will be turned off for the duration of the meeting tonight. You will only be unmuted if and when I unmute you during the question and answer session if you are a phone caller. Questions will be addressed during the question and answer session after the PowerPoint presentation. First, the service will answer questions submitted through registration for this virtual meeting. If time allows, the service will then allow attendees to submit questions. We will do our best to address questions in the order they come in to allow everyone an opportunity to voice their questions. Instructions for how to submit questions electronically during the session will be provided after the service's presentation, and we will allow those joining by computers to submit questions electronically and those joining by phone to submit questions verbally, as they do not have access to the chat feature to submit questions electronically. Again, after the question and answer session, the service will provide closing remarks. So with that, I will now turn it over to the Southeast Regional Director, Leo Miranda Castro, who will provide the welcome to tonight's meeting.
Thank you so much, Megan, and thank you everybody for participating here tonight. Good evening. Buenas noches a todos. Welcome to tonight's virtual meeting on our notice of finding for the Gopher Tortoise, a keystone species in the Southeast region, and one of my personal favorites. You can see my background. That's an area on my own personal property where we are enhancing some really good habitat for the tortoise. Once again, my name is Leo Miranda Castro. I'm the director for the Southeast region of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And first of all, thank you for, again, being here tonight, spending some time on this important species, and we will be able to answer a lot of the questions. If we cannot do that at the end, we will actually gather some of the additional questions and get back to everybody through our public websites. I know that a lot of you are here to get many answers, and thank you for everybody that has submitted many questions already. So I really appreciate that, and on behalf of the Fish and Wildlife Service, thank you for that. With all of that in mind, I would like to introduce our team here tonight. They have been working on Gopher tortoises for many years, and they've been working very closely with a lot of experts from academia, from state agencies, other federal agencies, as well as private landowners and private entities. And they are here tonight to present the information contained in the assessment, discuss the findings, and answer your questions. Tonight, we have with us Lourdes Mena. She's from the Division of Classification and Recovery in the Florida Field Office for the Fish and Wildlife Service. John Tupi, Mississippi Field Office, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Melissa Lombardi, Division of Conservation and Classification for the Southeast Regional Office, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Scott Hoffman, Branch of Delisting and Foreign Species from Falls Church, Virginia, in our headquarters office. Connor McGowan, Research Wildlife Biologist with the U.S. Geological Service. Brian Folk, Ecologist with the U.S. Geological Survey. Jane Cook, Cartographic Technician in the Florida Field Office, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Mike Marshall, Project Director from Texas A&M Natural Resource Institute. Nicole Rankin, she's the Chief of Division of Conservation and Classification here in the Southeast region. And Joe Emanuel, also with the Fish and Wildlife Service's Florida Field Office. And Joe is the one that of our species leads and will be providing a lot of the information tonight. And she has been an integral part in the development of the Species Status Assessment, or SSA. She's going to provide the overview and then pass it on to other of our experts. So we will be happy to answer some of your questions submitted previously. And if we have time, like we mentioned earlier, we will be able to get some more questions live. With that, I will pass it on to Joe.
Thank you, Leo, and good evening, everyone. We're going to present an overview of the biological information and modeling projections from the Gopher Tortoise Species Status Assessment, as well as the service's decisions, which were recorded in the October 12th Federal Register notice. Next slide. So a little bit on our federal actions history. In 1987, the Gopher Tortoise was listed as a threatened species in the western portion of its range. This was primarily due to threats associated with habitat loss and modification, as well as harvest for human consumption and road mortality. In January of 2006, the service was petitioned to list and designate critical habitat for gopher tortoises occurring in the eastern portion of the range. In July 2011, in response to that petition, the service found that the eastern range warranted listing, but listing was precluded due to higher priority actions. The eastern population of gopher tortoises was included in subsequent annual candidate notices of review. Between 2019 and 2021, the service completed a species status assessment on the gopher tortoise, evaluating the condition of the species range-wide. So for those participants not familiar with the species status assessment, this is frequently referred to as an SSA. This is the instrument that the service uses to compile the best available information regarding the species biology and factors that influence the species viability. So as you can see in the diagram to the upper left of your screen, the SSA report, this is a living document that the service uses to inform our decisions under the Endangered Species Act. And that includes listing decisions such as the one that was required for the gopher tortoise. And below that diagram, we note our species status assessment core team, which Leo just introduced. The core team coordinated with species and habitat experts during the development of the SSA. All states across the species range participated in the SSA process. And additionally, we requested review from 7 peer reviewers and integrated those responses into our assessment where appropriate. And so finishing up the timeline on our right, upon completion of the draft SSA in August of 2021, the service held several recommendation team meetings. We finished up on October 12th with a notice of finding for the gopher tortoise, which was published to the Federal Register on that date. Next slide. The gopher tortoise occurs in the southeastern Atlantic and Gulf coastal plains from southern South Carolina through Peninsula Florida, ranging west through the Florida Panhandle and including portions of Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and eastern Louisiana. The eastern portion of the range is indicated in the light gray color on the map. It includes all portions of the range occurring east of the Mobile and Tombigbee rivers. Those are also indicated. The western portion of the range is indicated in black. It includes all areas west of those rivers. The core of the gopher tortoise range is in the eastern portion, includes Peninsula Florida as well as southern Georgia. Next slide. The gopher tortoise, Gopherus polyphemus, was first described by Dowden in 1802. And as we discussed the eastern and western portions of the range, it's important to note there is no taxonomic distinction of the gopher tortoise in any portion of the range. Gopher tortoises are large, long-lived terrestrial turtles. They have domed grayish-black carapaces with yellow hingeless plastrons. The hind feet are elephantine or stumpy. Forelimbs are shovel-like with claws used for digging. Adults can grow to between up to 15 inches in length and weigh up to about 13 pounds. The diet of the gopher tortoise primarily includes broadleaf grasses, some legumes and fruits. They're known to consume a wide range of other plant species as well as insects and carrion. Gopher tortoises are fossorial. They excavate and utilize their own burrows. These burrows are central to their life history. Gopher tortoise burrows are used for sheltering from cold weather, retreat from summer heat, as well as protection from predators and fires. The nests of gopher tortoises are often constructed near the entrance of the burrows, and hatchlings and yearling tortoises may shelter in the burrows of adults as well. Gopher tortoises are a keystone species in the habitats they occupy, and as such, those gopher tortoise burrows are used by more than 350 other species, and you can see the commensals illustrated in the graphic to the lower right of the screen. Next slide. So typical gopher tortoise habitat, it occurs on well-drained sandy soils. It consists of an open canopy, a sparse midstory, a diverse ground cover layer that's composed of herbaceous vegetation. The range of the gopher tortoise aligns pretty well with that of the longleaf pine. And while gopher tortoises are associated with longleaf pine uplands, such as sandhills, clay hills, and pine savannas, they do occur in conjunction with other canopy species and in other natural communities, such as scrub, flatwood, xeric hammocks, and coastal communities too. So for the most part, these natural communities rely on frequent disturbance. This is primarily in the form of fire. It's necessary for the perpetuation and maintenance of habitat conditions that the gopher tortoise requires. In some, gopher tortoises require large swaths of interconnected, high-quality habitat. This is what's needed to support viable populations of gopher tortoises and ultimately lead to high resilience of the species. It's important to note when we think about habitat that the western extent of the range, those areas tend to have soils that include higher clay content, and this may contribute to lower abundance and density of gopher tortoises in these areas as compared to the sandier soils found in the eastern portions of the range. Next slide. So there are many factors that influence the current and future viability of the gopher tortoise. This is a very well-studied species, and in this assessment, we considered numerous influencing factors. I've got some of those listed here. But in addition, we considered things like disease, predation, incompatible land uses, as well as invasive species. However, the three primary threats that we carried forward into our future condition analysis includes the threats associated with habitat loss and degradation, primarily due to urbanization and development, the effects of climate change, including increased drought, higher temperatures, and sea level rise, and the effects of insufficient or incompatible habitat management. Next slide. And so looking at the factors that influence viability for the gopher tortoise, we also consider conservation measures. So in the left column here on your screen, we include the suite of regulatory tools and programs that serve to provide conservation at the federal level, such as those listed here for the Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as the NRCS and the Forest Service. This is not an exhaustive list. Below that, we see at the state level, each state within the range continues to provide protection for the gopher tortoise, and you can see the state protections listed there in the table below. There's also several partnerships and tools that help to implement conservation of gopher tortoises and gopher tortoise habitat. Again, not an exhaustive list here in the center of the screen, but there are many partnerships, agreements, best management practices, strategies, and initiatives that are implemented across a wide range of stakeholders. And those also provide guidelines or framework that are necessary to implement conservation actions that benefit gopher tortoises. Over on the right, in the right column, for land conservation, in the analysis, we calculated approximately 1.7 million acres of gopher tortoise habitat occurring on public lands range-wide. And in general, land management of these lands is implemented through resource management planning documents. So management is expected on most of these lands. Subsequent to the 12-month finding between 2011 and 2019, under a candidate conservation agreement among partners, there's been a concerted effort to acquire land for the conservation benefit of gopher tortoises. And as you can see here, through this agreement, 145,000 acres, more than that, were acquired for gopher tortoise conservation by federal and state partners. Additionally, since 2015 in Georgia, through the Gopher Tortoise Initiative there, Georgia has protected 26 viable populations of gopher tortoises and approximately 124,000 acres of land. Next slide. And so in addition to public conservation lands, we also considered private lands with gopher tortoise occurrences or gopher tortoise habitat. Most of the forested lands within the range of the gopher tortoise are in private ownership, and much of that is managed for forest production. So through the development of this SSA, we did coordinate with forest industry partners to gather information about the status of the gopher tortoise and the management of habitat on these private forest lands. So just to provide an example here, through the coordination with large working forest ownerships, the National Council for Air and Stream Improvements reported to us through our data inquiry and collection period over 10,000 observations of gopher tortoises occurring on these private ownerships between 2013 and 2019. So conservation on these private forest lands is frequently accomplished through various best management practices, various forest certification programs, and through many partnerships and collaboration with other stakeholders. There are challenges and uncertainties that are associated with private forest lands, including a general lack of gopher tortoise data, including spatial components to those observations, and a limited understanding as to the amount and condition of habitat within these land ownerships. And as private lands, there is the potential for conversion to development or other incompatible land uses. Next slide. So moving into the analysis, the core team delineated 5 analysis units for the purpose of analysis and comparison within the SSA only. These were not developed for policy applications. The 5 units depicted in the larger map, these are our analysis units. These were developed based on current genetic understanding, substantial barriers to dispersal, including large rivers. We leaned into the level 4 EPA ecoregions and relied on expert input to delineate those units. The Gillard 2017 genetic study, it identified 5 genetic groups that could be used as management units. And in the SSA, these 5 genetic groups, which you can see in the inset map, aligned well with our other considerations and formed the basis of representation units for analysis in the assessment. Next slide. So after we delineated the analysis units to the extent possible, we then moved into delineation of gopher tortoise populations. And so we received a variety of data. It came in many different formats, and that's largely a result of variation in survey methods in the field. The available data, the data that was provided to us, was organized into two groups. So as you can see on the left here, we have spatially explicit data and we have county centroid data. And I'll explain those a little bit here. Spatially explicit data, those are the data that are derived from systematic surveys on the ground, provided burrow locations and other metrics that allowed us to develop population estimates. This data came primarily from public lands where gopher tortoise burrow surveys were conducted. And additionally, the spatially explicit data is the data forecasted in our future condition modeling effort. Looking at the county centroid data, the majority of this data was collected via a private landowner questionnaire. The private lands data set is quite limited, and additionally, these data lack spatial information components that we would need to kind of derive those population estimates. This lack of spatial information is due primarily to issues associated with privacy on the landowner's part. The county centroid data, in addition, was not incorporated into the future condition modeling. It's important to acknowledge here that the data received does represent a subset of gopher tortoises that are likely to occur on the landscape, so we don't have information for all tortoises. And then next, kind of following that arrow at the top from the spatially explicit data to the right of the screen, we delineated populations using that spatially explicit data. We delineated at two spatial scales. We have local populations and landscape populations. This was done by buffering aggregations of individuals or burrows, and that was based on movement distances that were identified in published literature, as well as in conjunction with our species experts. Next slide. So through our delineation process, we identified 656 local populations occurring within 253 landscape populations. The map here shows the distribution of populations across the range. And the table to the right of your screen shows the number of spatially delineated populations by state. And so as mentioned, the core of the gopher tortoise range is primarily Peninsula Florida and Georgia, which, as you can see in this table here, includes the largest number of both local and landscape populations. Next slide. In this assessment, we described current resiliency as either high, moderate, or low based on estimated abundance of gopher tortoises within local populations. So based on the spatially explicit data, we estimated over 149,000 gopher tortoises within those 656 local populations that we delineated range-wide. The map depicts the distribution of the three resiliency classes. We have 360 populations in low condition, so those are depicted by kind of yellow tortoises on the map. We have 169 populations in moderate condition, so those are in blue, and 127 populations in high condition, were in red. And then looking at the pie charts, you can see the proportion of condition classes within the eastern and western portions of the range. Most of the gopher tortoises occur in the eastern portion of the range, and this is where we have 22% of those populations in high resiliency condition, 27% are in moderate, and 51% in low condition. In the western portion of the range, comparing, 90% of the populations occurring there are in low condition currently. And again, there's likely some influence to the prevalence of less suitable clay soils in those areas. Next slide. And so moving into the future condition analysis, we worked with scientists from the University of Florida and the US Geological Survey to build a predictive model to simulate how gopher tortoise populations might respond to changes in the environment in the future. So on the left of the screen is the model matrix, which was published earlier this year, the citation for which is included below. As mentioned in previous slides, only spatially explicit populations were forecasted in this model, the majority of which do occur on public conservation lands. The model, a little bit about the model, it's a stochastic female-only model that predicts how the abundance of female tortoises will change in the future, given demographic rates experienced at local population levels. The model incorporates other published models to evaluate expected effects of threats on gopher tortoise habitat. And the modeling framework supports the future condition analysis by estimating changes in population growth and persistent probabilities, while also considering and accounting for geographic variations in the Gopher tortoise life history. And to encompass a range of future conditions and to account for uncertainty associated with the other published models that we leaned into, we developed several plausible scenarios that reflected changes in levels of threats, including climate warming, sea level rise, urbanization, and shifts in habitat management. So those influences that we discussed a few slides back. We looked at model projections at 3 timeframes, 40 years, 60 years, and 80 years into the future. This is a long-lived species. Gopher tortoises live a while, so these timeframes do represent approximately 1 generation for tortoises. Next slide. So this slide here, to simulate how future conditions might influence gopher tortoise populations, we reviewed literature for published effects on tortoise demographic rates and used those results to build the model linking demographic rates to environmental and anthropogenic effects on tortoise populations. And we'll just kind of click through. So because temperature influences the growth and the reproductive rates of individuals, those first red lines there show where we modeled climate warming effects on growth transition rates of juveniles and the reproductive rates of adults. The yellow lines there, because climate warming is also causing sea level rise, this might inundate coastal areas and limit available habitat for juveniles and adults. And these lines here for urbanization. Urbanization is known to influence habitat connectivity. So we modeled urbanization effects on immigration among nearby local populations. And then lastly, climate warming is expected to make conditions less favorable for the use of prescribed fire as a habitat management tool. So we modeled the effects of climate warming and urbanization on habitat management. So warming temperatures and increasing urbanization influenced burn probabilities of gopher tortoise habitat in those local populations, and that ultimately influences gopher tortoise populations. Next. So this table is getting into the details of the scenarios that were simulated to understand how potential future environmental conditions might influence gopher tortoise populations 80 years into the future. So for our modeling, we incorporated the 4 published models at the bottom of the screen. You can see here we have the IPCC climate model, the NOAA sea level rise model, the sleuth urbanization model, and the fire management model from the 2020 Kupfer et al. Publication. So because future conditions are uncertain, we simulated these different scenarios to capture a range of future conditions. And so looking at the top 3 scenarios, I think we can circle those. Yep. You can see we included low, medium, and high values for predicted climate warming, sea level rise, and urbanization based on those published models for these variables. And so these 3 are referred to as our low, medium, and high stressors. We then applied the values from the medium stressors to the scenarios to build out the remaining scenarios where habitat management and immigration were manipulated. And you can see those pulled down, those numbers pulled down there. And in doing this, we then held the medium stressor values and then varied the levels of habitat management and immigration. Next slide. So here we look at some of the mapped results for the future condition analysis. The circles on these maps indicate relative size of populations, larger populations depicted by larger circles, smaller populations with smaller circles. And in looking at the current condition in the upper left, this shows the compilation of that spatially explicit data that we received and were able to generate an initial population size estimate for. Through the model under the medium threat scenario, we were then able to project each population into the future time steps here through the year 2100, which you can see in the lower right. Of the modeled populations, most scenarios predicted between 170 and 200 populations remaining on the landscape 80 years in the future at year 2100. Most scenarios projected 30 to 40% of populations will remain on the landscape, with 60 to 70% unlikely to remain. It's important to note here that populations with very small initial population sizes in the current condition, so those populations with 3 or fewer adult females, were not modeled as they were thought to be unlikely to remain. And then you can see in these maps where the larger populations remain in the core of the range in southern Georgia and Florida. And in general, large populations do remain, smaller populations drop off. But important populations remain on the landscape across all 5 analysis units in the year 2100 in all of our modeled future scenarios. Next slide. And to wrap up the future condition, just a few key takeaways here. We want to point out that the spatially explicit populations included in the model represent a small subset of gopher tortoises that likely occur on the landscape, and that we modeled only considered populations occurring on conservation lands where habitat management was expected to occur. So projections among plausible future scenarios indicate that gopher tortoise populations are likely to remain among all analysis units at the 80-year time step. And areas with the greatest likelihood of remaining on the landscape in the future include the core of the range, again, Georgia and Peninsula Florida. In our future model projections, immigration affected future populations more so than the stressors or threats. And to that end, larger populations connected to other nearby populations were more likely to remain on the landscape than smaller populations with less connectivity. And while the number of individual gopher tortoises and populations are expected to decline across each modeled projection interval, overall projections suggest that the extinction risk for gopher tortoises is relatively low in the future. And so now I'm going to pass this over to Melissa, and she's going to present an overview of the decision process and the determinations.
Thanks so much, Joe. Well, before we talk about the services determinations for the gopher tortoise, I think it's important to keep in mind the definitions of species listing status under the Endangered Species Act. So an endangered species is defined as a species that is in danger of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range. And a threatened species is defined as a species that is likely to become an endangered species within the foreseeable future throughout all or a significant portion of its range. So in the Federal Register notice, we explain our decisions on the gopher tortoise, and I want to summarize those for us now. We determined that the species did not meet the definition of endangered or threatened under the Act, either range-wide or in a significant portion of the range. We also found that the western portion of the range met the criteria for a distinct population segment, and that the current threatened status was appropriate for that DPS. For the eastern portion of the range, we determined that it also met the criteria for a DPS, distinct population segment, and that it did not meet the definition of threatened or endangered. So the eastern DPS is no longer a candidate with the publication of the 12-month finding of not warranted for listing. In this slide and the 2 other process slides for the eastern and western portions of the range, I'll step through the services decisions. The structure of the Federal Register notice follows the order I'll step through these determinations. We'll look at the process as we go, and I'll describe the relevant policy as we get to those steps. We first assess the status of gopher tortoise range-wide, so the eastern and western portions of the range, and determine that the species is not in danger of extinction now and is not likely to become endangered in the foreseeable future. So it does not meet the ESA definitions of endangered or threatened and is not warranted for listing. Then, having determined that the species is not warranted for listing, we conducted the evaluation for the policy around the significant portion of the range. If we find there is a significant portion of the range with a status other than not warranted, then we list the species as the status of that portion range-wide. So we looked across the range to determine if any geographic area met both prongs of the significant portion of the range policy, those criteria. And that would be having both a different status than the rest of the area we're looking at, so range-wide here, and then also the significance criteria. So there's an additional component with a significant portion of the range evaluation than what we looked at with just the range-wide status. So our decision makers identified the SSA analysis units 1, 2, and 5 as areas to consider, and found that Unit 5 in Peninsular Florida does not have a different status than not warranted for listing. We determined that Units 1 and 2 may have a different status than not warranted. So we then looked at the policy significance for those two units to determine if either of those areas met the bar for a significant portion of the range. And we found that although some aspects of the species life history and the habitat are different in units 1 and 2, those areas do not contain unique aspects of the species needs or resources that the species depends on that are unavailable elsewhere in the range. So those two areas did not meet our current understanding of the significance under the policy, and we did not find a significant portion of the range. I think it's important to note that the significance criteria in our analysis is a policy term, and it's separate from any meaning of importance to the conservation of the species. When making the status determination range-wide, decision makers considered the past, ongoing, and future anticipated threats, including habitat loss and fragmentation due to urbanization, climate warming, sea level rise, and habitat management. In finding the species not in danger of extinction now, so not endangered, they considered the number, the distribution, and the resiliency of populations across the range. To determine if the gopher tortoise meets the definition of threatened, they considered the threats that are expected to continue to affect the species in the future and the species' response to those threats. The western portion of the range was federally listed as threatened before the 1996 Distinct Population Segment policy. So we evaluated the western portion to determine if it meets the discreteness and the significance criteria under that policy. We found that the western portion, the one currently listed as threatened, does meet the criteria in the DPS policy. It's discrete, so markedly separate from other populations due to the physical separation with the Mobile and Tombigbee rivers and genetic uniqueness. And the western portion meets the DPS significance criteria in that a loss of the area would be a significant gap in the range, and the area differs markedly again in those genetic characteristics. We then determined the status of the western DPS as likely to become endangered in the foreseeable future. So the current threatened status is appropriate and no status change is needed for the western DPS. Decision makers also did not identify any areas within the western DPS that may meet the definition of endangered, so no SPR. In evaluating the status of the species, we always use the best available science and determined the threats affecting the species range-wide also affect the western DPS. In addition to that, some population characteristics in the western DPS, including those smaller populations with lower abundance and decreased reproduction compared to the eastern portion of the range, mean that these threats can have an outsized impact on populations. In addition, habitat is more fragmented in this area and less habitat management occurs in the western DPS compared to the eastern portion. When evaluating the status of the western DPS, most of the local populations within the DPS currently have low resiliency, so that ability to bounce back from environmental or population changes. However, the gopher tortoise currently occurs on 103,000 acres in the western DPS. In addition, 106 spatially explicit populations at varying levels of resiliency occur in the western DPS and are distributed across the geographic area of that DPS. Gopher tortoises are a long-lived species, and populations currently occur in the western DPS with reproduction and recruitment reported from populations on public and private lands. Future projections show increasingly disconnected populations and overall decline in the number of individuals and populations, particularly small populations. But gopher tortoise populations will remain on the landscape despite current and ongoing threats. Decision makers found that the western DPS is likely to become endangered in the foreseeable future, so remains federally listed as threatened. In evaluating the eastern portion of the range, we again looked at whether it meets DPS criteria. The eastern portion meets the criteria of discreteness, again due to the physical separation, the Mobile and Tombigbee rivers, and it meets the significance criteria under the DPS policy because the loss of this portion would be a significant gap in the range. Decision makers then considered the status of the eastern DPS and determined that it was not warranted for listing, so the candidate or warranted but precluded finding was withdrawn. The candidate withdrawal was informed by the information provided by federal, state, non-government organizations, and private partners regarding gopher tortoise abundance and habitat condition in the Eastern DPS to inform our analysis of the species condition. In determining the status of the Eastern DPS, decision makers considered that it comprises the majority of current gopher tortoise range and includes about 85% of local gopher tortoise populations across the range. Although the range-wide threats we described also affect the Eastern DPS, over 40% of populations exhibit moderate or high current resiliency. These populations with higher resiliency are expected to withstand stochastic and catastrophic change and maintain adaptive capacity. In addition, habitat restoration efforts, implementation of best management practices, and conservation measures to benefit the gopher tortoise have contributed to the current condition of the species. Future projections of species condition show that 167 to 175 populations will remain across the Eastern DPS in the modeled timeframe, keeping in mind that the model includes only populations on conservation lands that we have information for. For the Eastern DPS, with the additional information and updated analyses, we determined that the species does not meet the definition of threatened or endangered under the Act. Just like with the Western DPS, having determined that the species is not warranted for listing in the Eastern DPS, we then evaluated the DPS for any areas within it that may meet the significant portion of the range criteria. Similar to a range-wide analysis, decision makers considered units 2 and 5, and again found that Unit 5 in Peninsular Florida did not have a different status than the remainder of the Eastern DPS. We found that Unit 2 may have a different status than not warranted, but did not meet policy significance needed to meet that half of the SPR criteria. So we found that there's no SPR in the Eastern DPS. Species is not warranted for listing in the Eastern DPS. So we issued the notice of finding of not warranted and included the candidate withdrawal in the Federal Register notice. This concludes the walkthrough of the service's recent decisions regarding gopher tortoise. We'll provide links to the notice and the supporting documents and ways to communicate with the service, and then move to the question and answer portion of the meeting. The notice of findings and the supporting documentation, including the SSA and the future model publication, are available at the link shown on regulations.gov. If you would like to communicate with us further following this public meeting, we've set up the Gopher Tortoise email at the address shown, and we've also provided contact information for the species leads in the Eastern and Western DPS. This concludes our presentation, and I'll turn this back over to Megan to facilitate the question and answer portion of the meeting.
Perfect. Thank you, Melissa. With that, we'll go ahead and get started with our pre-registered questions. But first, I'll walk through some instructions. So the service will be accepting questions through the scheduled end time of this webinar. The intent of this question and answer session is to answer any substantive questions you have for USFWS staff on the Gopher Tortoise. We ask that you keep any questions related to the scope of the Gopher Tortoise. The USFWS wants to hear from all members of the public who are interested in voicing their questions. We ask that you please be mindful of the number of questions you ask and pay attention to questions from others in case your question is asked by someone else and responded to by USFWS staff. If you submitted your question when you registered for the meeting tonight, please note that you will not need to resubmit your question via the chat or over the phone. We will begin by answering these pre-registered questions. If time allows, we will open the meeting to any additional questions. We will do our best to answer questions in the order they are received. In the event that we have time to answer more questions, I want to go ahead and provide instructions for how to do so. So on the next slide, we have these instructions on the left for how to submit questions via the chat feature, and on the right via phone. So after we've gone through questions submitted via the Zoom web platform or Zoom app chat feature, we will move on to participants calling in over the phone who would like to ask a question. So please stay tuned for those instructions. At this time, if you have a question and you're using the Zoom web platform or Zoom app, you can go ahead and click on the chat icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you hover your mouse over the bottom of your Zoom screen, the chat icon should appear. You may need to exit your full screen view in Zoom to see the chat icon. You can then type your question in the chat box and please send it to hosts and panelists. I will then read the question aloud for all participants to hear, and a USFWS staff member will respond to your question aloud. We will try to answer your questions in the order they are received. And please note there may be a pause between asking your question and a USFWS staff member answering your question. For those calling in through the phone who would like to ask a question, you can press *9 to raise your hand to let staff know you have a question. When it is your turn, I will identify you by the last 4 digits of your phone number. I will then unmute you so that you can ask your question. Again, a USFWS staff member will then respond to your question aloud. You may be muted on your end. If that is the case, we will prompt you to unmute yourself by pressing *6. So we'll go ahead and leave these instructions up throughout the remainder of tonight's meeting, and we'll move on to our pre-registered questions. So we did receive several questions about the impact of solar farms on Gopher Tortoise habitat, and I'm going to turn that over to Joe to speak to.
Thank you, Megan. In the Gopher Tortoise species status assessment, we considered the effects of habitat loss and fragmentation, including the influences of solar farm development on the species. We also noted solar development industry siting efforts and ongoing coordination with the service. In addition, state-led regulations and permitting requirements will continue to be in place as solar and other alternative energy efforts expand. As an agency, the service will work with landowners and companies to develop habitat conservation plans or other beneficial management plans for the species on new and existing solar farms. For example, the Gopher Tortoise Council and state wildlife agencies within the range of the Gopher Tortoise have developed voluntary best management practices for solar development that are compatible with the conservation of Gopher tortoises. And these practices have been implemented or used in South Carolina, Florida, Alabama, and Georgia. Next.
Perfect. Thank you, Joe. So we also had several participants submit questions regarding the status of the species in several areas. Our first question was, if the species is not doing as well in the western portion of the range, then why not uplist it to endangered? And we'll turn that over to Melissa.
Sure, thanks, Megan. Well, we evaluated the status of the Western DPS, of course, using the best available science that we have. We looked at those threats that we talked about in the presentation, and also thought about those population characteristics that can have an outsized impact there in the Western DPS. We also considered the distribution of the populations across the 103,000 acres where they occur in the Western DPS, and also those characteristics of Gopher tortoises with as a long-lived species. We expect that they will remain on the landscape for several decades, despite the current and ongoing threats. So considering all that, we found that the Western DPS does not meet the definition, of endangered. So in danger of extinction, and does not warrant listing as endangered. However, we found that it does meet the definition of threatened, so likely to become endangered in the foreseeable future, and should remain with that current listing status. We believe that threatened status is appropriate because the future projections show, although the populations are increasingly disconnected, some overall decline, but populations with recruitment and reproduction do remain on the landscape in the future.
Perfect. Thank you, Melissa. So with that, we'll move on to our next pre-registered question, which is, The service often refers to the gopher tortoise as a keystone species. If this is accurate, why isn't the service extending federal protections to a species that is so ecologically important? And we'll turn that over to Nicole.
Thank you, Megan. As Leo mentioned during his introduction, we do recognize the gopher tortoise as a keystone species, and gopher tortoises do play that key role in their ecosystems, including the use of their burrows by several hundred other species. However, listing a species because of its role in the ecosystem is not required by the Endangered Species Act. It is not necessary for a determination that a species meets the definition of an endangered or threatened species. While the tortoise is a keystone species, we evaluated whether the gopher tortoise meets the definition of endangered or threatened, as Melissa outlined previously. In our species status assessment, we did include these aspects of gopher tortoise life history, including its role in the habitat and ecological community of where it occurs. As Melissa just mentioned a minute ago, we determined that in the Western DPS that it should remain listed as threatened. But in our assessment of the current and future viability of the Eastern DPS, we determined that it does not meet the definition of endangered or threatened. But we do recognize how the gopher tortoise will continue to play and serve its role as a keystone species across the range.
Thank you, Nicole. Our next pre-registered question is, the SSA Analysis Unit 2 is projected to decline similarly to the listed Unit 1. Could you describe why it was not considered a DPS or a significant portion of the range within the Eastern DPS? And we'll turn that over to Melissa.
Thanks, Megan. Yes, so we apply the DPS policy sparingly. And in our evaluation, in our recommendation, we assess the eastern and western portion of the range based on the currently listed portion of the range and the 2006 petition. Within that, we determined that the western and eastern portions met the criteria of the DPS policy. We evaluated the SSA Analysis Unit 2 in our significant portion of the range analyses, both as part of our range-wide analysis and for the Eastern DPS analysis. So like we described in the notice of findings, we looked at the two prongs of the significant portion of the range policy. So a geographic area has to meet both the status prong and the significance prong. If it doesn't meet either one of those, then the area is not an SPR. It's not a significant portion of the range. So we determined that Unit 2 may have a different status than either range-wide or the Eastern DPS, and both of those is not warranted. So we then assessed significance of the area under just the SPR policy. And that, again, that policy significance, it doesn't mean that the area is not important to conservation or that it's not needed to maintain and improve the species condition. It's restricted only to the definition of significance under the SPR policy and our current understanding of it. Our decision makers did not find that Unit 2 contains a resource or an aspect of the life history that's unique to that area that is not available elsewhere in the range or in the Eastern DPS. So did not rise to the level of an SPR, either range-wide or within the Eastern DPS.
Great, thank you, Melissa. Our next question is, how are the 5 geographic units which had different population status considered in the decision not to list the Eastern population? And we'll turn that over to Nicole.
Thank you, Megan. The eastern population of the gopher tortoise includes 4 of the SSA analysis units that Jo mentioned during her presentation. So we evaluated the species' current and future condition as we evaluated the Eastern DPS in the context of the listing decision in this candidate portion of the range. So we looked at those 4 analysis units. The 4 units were evaluated as a whole. Units 2 and 5, as Melissa has mentioned, were identified as potential geographic areas to be evaluated under the significant portion of the range policy. Additionally, we have not received any other petitions for the species and have no other assessments or review in process at this time.
Perfect. All right. Our next question is, why are the representative units from the SSA not considered when defining distinct population segments? And we'll turn that over to Joe.
Thanks. The delineation of analysis units was intended for the purposes of analysis for context and comparison within the SSA only. These analysis units were not delineated as listing boundaries. And as I mentioned in the presentation, we did base the analysis unit delineations on our current genetic understandings, those barriers to dispersal, those big rivers, ecoregions from the level 4 EPO ecoregions list, as well as our species experts. We assessed the listed western portion of the range and the candidate petitioned eastern portion of the range when evaluating the portions as distinct population segments.
Great, thank you, Joe. All right, our next question is the service considering the development of a 4D rule for the western population? And we'll turn that over to Nicole.
Thank you, Megan. So depending on our workload and our other priorities, we'll consider a revision of entity notice for the Western DPS. And at that time, we would consider a species-specific 4D rule that includes the regulations that are necessary and advisable for the conservation of the DPS. At this moment in time, the species does have a 4D rule in terms of it receives the blanket protections of an endangered species at the time it was originally listed.
Great, thank you. All right, so the following questions center around state protections and conservation efforts. Our first question is, what will happen if states and others do not continue the conservation efforts or state protections change? And again, we'll turn that over to Nicole.
Thanks, Megan. So as Joe mentioned during her presentation, in our determination, we considered implemented and ongoing conservation efforts and that we expect to continue. So if the best available information indicates that the condition of the species has changed or is changing in the future, then we may choose to undertake a discretionary review of the species status, or we could be petitioned again. And then we would undertake that status review at that time.
Great, thank you. Our next question is a combination of a few questions seeking clarification of whether the determination will impact forestry practices, if it will reduce any direct costs to home construction or development rules for relocation requirements, and if transmission lines are affected. So pre-registered participants asked what changes the finding entails for the Eastern DPS, if any. And we'll go ahead and turn that over to Melissa and just let me know if there's any parts of that question you want me to repeat.
Thanks, Megan. No, I think I'm good for that. So we just want to be clear, there's no federal delisting action in our notice of findings for Gopher Tortoise. The western portion of the range will remain listed as a threatened species and retain those protections under the Endangered Species Act. In the eastern portion of the range, the Eastern DPS, what we've referred to as the candidate range, the species has not previously been federally listed as an endangered or threatened species. So the notice of finding concludes that federal protection as an endangered or threatened species east of the Mobile and Tombigbee rivers is not warranted at this time. So there's essentially no change to the federal listing configurations for Gopher Tortoise. We do expect that state protections and regulations will remain in place though.
Perfect, thank you, Melissa. This one's a little bit similar. The question is, how will state protections for the Gopher Tortoise change? And we'll go ahead and turn that over to Lourdes, and she's not on. I know she was having some connectivity issues. We'll go ahead and turn that over to Nicole.
Yeah, thank you, Megan. So I think Melissa did a really great job of partially answering this question already, but I'll just kind of reiterate that our notice of finding did not change the species state listed status or any state regulations or protections or existing agreements that are in place. And we expect that states will continue to work towards the conservation of the species, and that regulations and protections for the gopher tortoise at the state level will remain in place. We will continue to work with our state partners and other conservations on conservation efforts for the gopher tortoise, as well as other species that occur within the range of the species.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, will all mitigatory actions in the Eastern Range now be handled on a state-by-state basis? And we'll go ahead and turn that over to Joe.
Thank you. State regulations and permitting programs, as we've said a few times, will remain in place. The service Gopher Tortoise guidelines are in place and can support state conservation efforts. State conservation programs, including translocation or other mitigation efforts, will continue to be managed and administered by the appropriate state agency as they were prior to our decision. The service's decision does not affect these programs or other management plans, so those should continue to guide these efforts.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, before August 2007, Florida issued incidental take permits to developers that allowed them to bury tortoises without relocating them in exchange for habitat mitigation fees. Although the state of Florida changed that policy, the permits issued before August 2007 don't expire. Many of these lands currently remain undeveloped. However, an estimated 22,000 gopher tortoises will be legally entombed if these lands are developed. How can the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service justify this in its decision to not federally protect the gopher tortoise in its eastern range? And we'll go ahead and turn that over to Joe.
Thank you. So between 1991 and 2007, the incidental take permit regulatory program generated approximately $55 million in mitigation funding that resulted in the acquisition of over 15,000 acres of land specifically purchased for gopher tortoise conservation. So these lands are perpetually managed for gopher tortoises using funding from the state of Florida. And although the incidental take permits are no longer issued, they are perpetual, with many of them still active. The incidental take permittees do have the option to relocate gopher tortoises on site, or they can amend their permit to relocate gopher tortoises to an approved recipient site with no additional mitigation costs. So between 2009 and early 2019, there have been 151 of these incidental take permits that have the humane relocation amendments that have resulted in the relocation of gopher tortoises off development sites to FWC approved recipient sites. And this has resulted in the humane relocation of more than 5,000 gopher tortoises. And so by comparison, prior to 2009, there were a total of 27 humane relocation amendments, resulting in the relocation of over 1,200 gopher tortoises prior to that.
Great, thank you. Awesome. We'll move on to our next question. The service received a few questions about protections of gopher tortoise populations in South Florida, and we'll go ahead and turn that over to John.
Yeah, hi. So we used the best scientific and commercial information to inform our decision. We considered the populations across the range, including those in South Florida, for which we had data. Again, thinking about those populations where we had spatially explicit data. As part of the SSA, we requested information from state and federal partners and private landowners. We received information from conservation and private lands. However, the data from some private lands was limited. It is important to note that data included in our analysis units represents only a subset of gopher tortoises likely to occur on the landscape. As such, population estimates within the SSA do not represent an assessment of all populations of gopher tortoises on the landscape, but it does represent the best available information that we had at the time. And I'll just add another quick note. It has become apparent that there were some populations in extreme South Florida, Miami-Dade County that might have been missed. So we apologize for that.
Great, thank you, John. All right, with that, we'll move to our next question. Also related to Florida. Florida is the heart of the tortoise's range and is projected to have the greatest declines of the species over the next 80 years. How can you defend not protecting it there? Uncontrolled urban sprawl has caused a shortage of relocation sites, so this move to deny it protection seems flawed, and we'll turn that over to Joe.
Thanks, Megan. So the Eastern DPS does comprise the majority of the current gopher tortoise range. So that occurs in portions of Alabama, Florida, Georgia, as well as South Carolina. And as we mentioned in the presentation, it does include the majority of local gopher tortoise populations across the range. So federal, state, non-governmental organizations and private partners have provided information about the gopher tortoise numbers and habitat conditions in the Eastern DPS to inform our analysis of the species condition. And so although threats including habitat loss and fragmentation due to urbanization, climate warming, sea level rise, and habitat management affect the populations, many of these populations are in good condition. So in addition to that, habitat restoration efforts, implementation of best management practices, and conservation measures specifically to benefit gopher tortoises have contributed to the current condition of the species. Future projections, which included modeling of urbanization and development of the species condition, show that many healthy populations will remain across the range. So overall, the projections suggest that extinction risk for gopher tortoises in the Eastern DPS is low in the future scenarios.
Thanks, Joe. Okay, our next question is, will surveys, Head Start, and habitat management programs continue to be funded? And we'll turn that over to John.
Sure. In the Western DPS, the species remains federally listed, and this decision does not affect existing funding sources or processes. Service programs, including Section 6 funding, Partners for Fish and Wildlife, Coastal Program, and other collaborative conservation programs will remain available for gopher tortoise conservation projects in the Western DPS. Gopher tortoises are state listed as endangered or threatened in Georgia, Florida, and South Carolina, and projects to benefit the species in those states may pursue funding under state administered service programs, including state wildlife grants. Projects that benefit gopher tortoise habitat or co-occurring species, including red-cockaded woodpeckers and eastern indigo snake, may also provide benefit to the Eastern DPS populations. In addition, other discretionary funding for gopher tortoise conservation efforts by state, federal, NGOs, or private organizations, including longleaf and sustainable forestry programs, may be continued based on those agency or organization policies. However, the withdrawal of the candidate status for the Eastern DPS means that the Eastern DPS is not listed, petitioned, proposed, or a warranted but precluded, also known as a candidate species. So projects that solely benefit the gopher tortoise will no longer be eligible for Section 6 funding. However, any projects currently funded will continue to be funded and supported through the performance period of the grants.
Great, thank you, John.
Mhm.
Our next question is, what happens to the CCA now? And we'll go ahead and turn that over to Melissa.
Thanks, Megan. As far as the CCA, the existing agreements, the conservation agreements that we have with multiple other parties, including the CCA, are still in place. We have no indication at this time that the parties to the agreements plan to discontinue the conservation actions that they carry out that are guided by those agreements. The agreements do contain provisions for withdrawal of signatories to the agreements. So any of the participating state or federal agencies, NGOs, could choose that, but we have not had indication from partners that that's expected.
Great, thank you. All right, our next question is, will the service maintain its strong support of partner efforts to enhance gopher tortoise habitat on private lands? And we'll turn that over to Nicole.
Thank you, Megan. Yeah, the service strongly supports our conservation efforts and supports our conservation partners, in the effort to enhance gopher tortoise habitat on private lands. Some service funding, however, is prioritized for actions that benefit listed and at-risk species, with the at-risk species defined as a petition species, a species proposed for listing, or a candidate species. Any currently approved projects will be supported through the period of performance, and we expect to continue work with private landowners as well as our state agency partners and other organizations on conservation actions that enhance gopher tortoise habitat in the future.
Great, thank you. All right, our next question is, you say that climate change will keep us from doing the prescribed burning that we need to do to maintain the habitat. It seems like that's going to push the species to the brink in that portion of the range. So we'll turn that over to Mike.
Thank you, Megan. So I think first I need to mention that we use Gopher et al. 2020 as the model to investigate changes in fire due to climate change. And while the implementation of prescribed fire may be challenging as a result of regional climate warming, particularly during the spring and summer, those models predict that the burn windows will shift over time with increased opportunities in the winter. So you have a temporal component there. Additionally, the same modeling suggests that there will be an increased risk of wildfire and a longer fire season. So it's possible that an increase in wildfires may mitigate those predicted decreases in the number of available burn days. Also, I'd like to add that land managers may utilize other tools such as chemical and mechanical treatments to help offset that reduced ability to burn.
Great, thank you, Mike. Our next question is, well, there were a few questions regarding what is being done to address the effects of hurricanes and coastal erosion on gopher tortoise habitat, and we'll turn that over to Nicole.
Thank you, Megan. So a primary defense of gopher tortoise habitat occurring in these coastal areas is to implement appropriate management and restoration actions. Other federal programs, including monitoring programs in the Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as the National Park Service, as well as our science partners in the U.S. Geological Survey and other agencies, are actively performing long-term monitoring of coastal systems to learn how these are changing and adapting over time. In addition, many of these same partners, as well as our state partners, have active restoration efforts occurring within coastal habitats.
Great, thank you. All right. Our next question is, how are private landowners helping with conservation? And we'll turn that over to Joe.
Thanks, Megan. So for this, we do estimate that approximately 80% of the land in the Gopher Tortoise Range is in private ownership. And we recognize the important role that private landowners can play in improving the habitat conditions for gopher tortoises. So private landowners contribute to conservation through management actions that promote that open canopy habitat conditions that we discussed in the presentation, looking to increase those herbaceous ground cover components. Depending on site conditions and landowner goals, habitat management actions may also include the application of prescribed fire, mechanical treatments, such as ones John's mentioned, looking again to create those open canopies. The 2013 Gopher Tortoise Conservation Strategy and a variety of best management practices and conservation initiatives do provide guidelines for Gopher Tortoise conservation on private lands. We do recommend coordinating with your local Fish and Wildlife Service office or your state agencies to develop a management plan or get technical assistance on best actions that could be mutually beneficial to your landowner goals as well as Gopher Tortoise habitat. And I think Leo may have had something to chime in on private landowners as well.
Thank you, Joe. And I really appreciate this question and all the others about private lands. And you have seen through the analysis here, a lot of what we've been considering within the agency is on state, federal lands, protected lands, but private lands are critical to the conservation of these species looking into the future. There are many, many programs out there. We have mentioned a few, Partners for Fish and Wildlife. We have mentioned coastal program, but there's a lot of Farm Bill, USDA Farm Bill programs that are also contributing to the conservation of these species. Anything that is done, for example, for relocated woodpeckers within the range of the Gopher Tortoise, that benefits Gopher Tortoises. Working Land for Wildlife, and many, many other state and federal programs, even private programs, Nature Conservancy and other NGOs that are contributing to this. Regardless of the species, doesn't need to be just for Gopher Tortoise, but if you manage the habitat, open pine, fire, you can see my background here. It's really important to maintain in the conservation of the Gopher Tortoises. The other thing is that state regulations are really, really, really important, and we got a few of those questions earlier. One of the factors within the Endangered Species Act that we consider heavily are those regulatory mechanisms in place already that protect the species. And all the states within the range of the Gopher Tortoise are doing an amazing job in protecting and regulating at the state level, not federal, at the state level, those populations. So that's something that we consider. If those regulations change and let's say that get eliminated at the state level, that is something that might trigger the Fish and Wildlife Service to reconsider this kind of listing decision or not listing decision. And we can get, because conditions will change, we will then very likely get petition to reconsider that decision. So I just want to make really, really very, very clear that state regulations in place right now are helping the conservation of the Gopher Tortoise. If those change, that might change the landscape of the species, and we might need to reconsider the decision, or we might get petition to reconsider the petition. But again, in summary, private lands conservation programs from other federal, state, and private entities are critical, as well as the state-based regulations. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Leo. All right, we'll move on to our next question, which is, what conservation efforts and practices have notably contributed to the recovery and conservation of the Gopher Tortoise? And again, we'll turn that over to Joe.
Thanks, Megan. So there's a good bit that we could unpack for this one, but during the SSA, there were many stakeholders that provided a lot of information to us. It contributed to our knowledge of the condition of Gopher Tortoise populations and their habitat. This enabled us to complete a pretty robust analysis in the SSA. Additionally, we gathered information about the existing regulatory mechanisms that Leo just mentioned. Various conservation efforts across the species range were considered. This is not an exhaustive list, but I'll rattle through some of the conservation actions that have directly contributed to Gopher Tortoise conservation. Since 2011, through concerted efforts of the Candidate Conservation Agreement for Gopher Tortoises, as well as the Gopher Tortoise Initiative and other projects to protect Gopher Tortoise habitat and Gopher Tortoise populations. We've seen more than 250,000 acres of land protected across the range. Additionally, as I mentioned in the presentation, within Georgia alone, this initiative has protected 26 viable populations of Gopher Tortoise. The Department of Defense partners, across 32 military installations have provided protections to Gopher tortoises and habitat through direct involvement with the CCA, as well as the incorporation of Gopher tortoise management and protection measures in the installation NRAMs, which are their management plans. So, and to highlight this, we can look to longstanding partnerships, such as the one we have with Eglin Air Force Base, where habitat improvement and management has created conditions that were ideal for receiving thousands of translocated Gopher tortoises, many of which came from those incidental take permit sites. So this effort has created within Eglin 10 viable populations where none existed prior to these efforts. So there has been a lot that's gone on to conserve and recover. Next.
Great, thank you. All right. Our next question was regarding the effect of coyotes on Gopher tortoise populations, and we'll turn that over to Mike.
Thank you, Megan. So we certainly considered predation in the SSA, and I think discussing this would be helpful to think about individual versus population effects. So predation of Gopher tortoise nests is variable, and Gopher tortoises are most vulnerable to predation within the first year of life. So while raccoons are the most frequently reported predator of nests and juvenile Gopher tortoises, other species, including coyotes, are known to predate nests and juvenile Gopher tortoises. Adult Gopher tortoises are less likely to experience that predation, except by canines, including coyotes. But while predation by coyotes may affect individuals, we could not quantify those effects at the population level and did not find that the threat from coyotes affected the species as a whole.
Great, thank you. All right, our next question is, can you please provide access to the data related to the models run for future projections of the species conditions across the range? And we'll turn that over to Nicole.
Thank you, Megan. So the published models used in our analyses, including Sleuth, the NOAA models, and the others that Mike and Joe and Melissa mentioned earlier, are all publicly available. And the species status assessment literature cited has more specific information about where those models can be accessed. And that is, as Melissa mentioned earlier, it's available at regulations.gov. So if you go back to that slide, you can get more easy access to locating that. The literature cited. For the future condition model in our species status assessment, location-specific and county-level data from years or decades of monitoring and surveys was provided to our team from other federal agencies, state agencies, industry organizations, conservation organizations, and private landowners. And we cannot withhold that information when requested under the Freedom of Information Act request. So data that we used in the run of our future model projections is available through that process.
Great, thank you. And we have one last pre-registered question before we move into the live questions we've received so far. This last question is, can you please describe how you estimated occupied and unoccupied potential habitat for the Gopher tortoise? And we'll turn that over to Mike.
Thank you, Megan. So I'm going to piggyback off of the last answer here. There were many published models that we used in this SSA, and the central model that we used is a Crawford et al. Model that you can find. It's publicly available in expert-informed habitat suitability analysis. So we used that model for all habitat estimates to get at occupied versus unoccupied. The occupied habitat was estimated as the total amount of habitat, as shown by the Crawford et al. Model, contained within our spatially delineated population buffers that we discussed earlier. So the unoccupied would just be the estimated habitat that was outside of those buffers. So although there could be tortoises occupying that habitat, we had no spatial data to estimate that. So the occupied is just our spatially delineated populations, and it's the habitat estimated within those population buffers.
Great, thank you so much. So with that, we'll go ahead and move on to the questions that have been coming in through the chat feature. Our first question that we have is, your model seems to predict a decline in populations in Southwest Georgia, a relatively low human population area. Why? Smaller populations to begin with? And we'll turn that over to Brian.
Thanks, Megan. So the scenarios that we simulated, actually using the model, actually predicted populations to decline across the entire species of the range, including Southwest Georgia. And like the question suggested, this result was largely because many of these populations in the current condition are extremely small and had fewer than 3 adult females in the current condition, and that these populations were unlikely to persist into the future, given the diverse threats that we modeled that included climate warming, changes in habitat management, urbanization, and sea level rise. And most of the future conditions scenarios that we simulated predicted many populations to be unlikely to persist across all of the different time steps that we simulated. But I'll also mention that all scenarios tended to predict many populations to also have extremely high persistence probabilities in the future, including populations in Southwest Georgia and elsewhere throughout the species range.
Great, thank you so much. All right. We've got a few more questions coming in the chat and through the chat. Again, we'll be on answering questions until the scheduled end time of this meeting. So for the next 30 minutes, and if you'd like to submit a question, you can look at the instructions up on the screen to do so. So with that, we'll go ahead and move on to our next question, which is, the NRCS has reduced the FY23 budget by 50%, or approximately 18.5 million this year alone for WLFW, Gopher Tortoise, and the LLPI combined. If those conservation practice funds are not restored, is it possible that this listing decision would be revisited in the future? Was continuance of these programs for some period of time assumed in the decision? And we'll go ahead and turn that over to Nicole and Leo.
Hi, Bridget. Thanks for the question. So I did want to mention that, when we evaluate species under the Endangered Species Act, it's based, we're evaluating it for the species. So if there's a noticeable decline, then that's when we would reevaluate the species. So it wouldn't be tied to specific funds needing to be restored in order for us to revisit a decision. And the continuance of these programs were not part of our listening decision. As was mentioned previously, we did those future scenario projections, and that looked at varying levels of habitat management in the future. And so, and part of that was, like a continuance of habitat management, but also a decrease in habitat management. So just wanted to mention those things there. And then I think Leo was gonna also chime in here.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you, Bridget, for that extremely important question. And policy-wise, Nicole is right on. That's something that funding levels and all of that is not part of the equation. However, across the landscape, all the conservation actions that have been going on for many years are assumed to continue. In terms of Farm Bill programs, regardless if it is Working Land for Wildlife, EQIP, Forest Service, Forest Stewardship Program, Fish and Wildlife Service programs, things like that. we are definitely expecting that those continue. If they stop or are significantly reduced, that could have an effect on across the landscape, and that might result in reductions of the resiliency of the species. So that's something to keep an eye on, because we are definitely relying on not only on public, federal, and state lands, but also on private lands, continuation of those management and stewardship practices. So the black and white answer in terms of the specific programs and funding levels, the answer is no. That is not part of the equation. However, if there's an effect of reduced conservation actions, proactive, voluntary, non-regulatory actions across the landscape, that's something that we will definitely keep an eye on. And I'm sure that many of our partners out there will be keeping close attention to that. If there are significant reductions of those in those practices, like my background here, if that's on private lands, if we stop doing prescribed burning, habitat restoration for open pine systems across the landscape, that's something to be concerned. So, so thank you for that question, because private lands conservation and all the programs that support that are critical to the conservation of this species and many, many other species too. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Nicole and Leo. All right, we'll move to our next question from the chat, which was, how can you model GT populations, private versus public lands, when in most cases, objectives are very different? Timber production versus ecological habitat manipulation, in parentheses, fire. And we'll go ahead and turn that over to Mike and then see if Leo has anything he'd like to add.
Sure, thank you. So it's really can be boiled down to one thing. Our ability to model these gopher tortoise populations into the future came down to one thing: whether or not we could actually spatially delineate those populations on a map. So in the case of the private lands data, or the vast majority of the private lands data, we did not have spatially explicit information. It was covered earlier that we use county centroids. So really, our ability to model those populations did not come down to management objectives being different. It came down to the fact that we just didn't have the ability to model those things because of the spatial context. I will hand it over to Leo to maybe talk about the differences in management objectives.
Thank you, Mike. No, and this is another excellent question here, because as you can see, we rely on the best available information, solid information. So we have been very conservative in terms of what conservation actions are out there. So we rely a lot in those models on data from state and federal public entities, basically. But on private lands, we have been very limited. But we know that there's a lot of really good conservation happening in private lands, like previous question, using farm bill programs that is millions and millions of dollars going directly to that kind of habitat management. In terms of the objective, the potential conflict between private landowner objective on producing fiber, timber, that versus the conservation of the species. We know that those tortoises are still in health. We still have really healthy populations in those lands, many private lands, and including industrial timber. So whatever is happening there is actually benefiting the tortoise. I'd rather see timberland than shopping malls, right? So that's something that we need to probably get even better, better data in terms of what are the conservation best management practices that are already happening that allows the gopher tortoise to still exist in healthy populations in on those lands. So that's something that I would like to explore even further. But in terms of the conflict, whatever is happening there, we still have the tortoises for many, many decades. Let's explore what those BMP's best management practices are on those private lands that are already producing, also producing fiber, timber. Those working lands are really important to the conservation of the species, not just on public lands. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you guys so much. All right. And we do just want to remind folks that tonight we want to ensure the chat feature is used for questions only. So if there's any information that you have about the Gopher Tortoise, you can feel free to send that to the Gopher Tortoise email, which we'll provide on the closing remarks slide. But again, we'll hope to keep this this session focused on questions. And right now, I don't see that we have many more questions in the chat. It looks like we have around 20 minutes or so left in our question and answer session tonight. There have been a few questions that have been really in depth and require a little bit more thought. So we do encourage those again to be submitted to the Gopher Tortoise email. And if anyone wants to add anything to that, feel free. So with that, we'll wait until more questions come in. All right, our next question is, was the assessment of juveniles considered for future scenario projections or only females? If juveniles were considered in the analysis, how does their survival into adulthood persist into the future? Are major declines in future generations expected in light of the threats, and were they considered in the no listing determination? And we'll turn that over to Brian.
So thanks, Megan. For this question, the answer is that yes, the survival of juveniles was considered in the modeling analysis across all the different scenarios. We modeled juvenile survival using the best available data, and we did account for the juvenile component of these populations in those analyses. But to the second point, so the first question is, were juveniles considered? Yes. Second part is, how does their survival into adulthood persist into the future? We modeled effects. Most of the effects that we modeled in our scenario analysis related to adult survival. It wasn't specific to juveniles, so that's kind of my answer to that. And then the last bit was, our major declines. Were they considered in the analysis? I can't comment on the last part of the question, but maybe with some more thought, we could get back to you about that. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Brian. And Nicole, do you have any more to add to that listing component of the question?
Sure, yeah. So I'll just mention, everything that was in the species status assessment, including in that modeling effort, was considered in our determination to the decision that it wasn't warranted for listing in the eastern portion of the range.
Great, thank you, Nicole. All right. We'll wait as more questions come in through the chat. And I don't see any hands raised, but again, if we do have any phone callers on tonight who would like to ask a question, you can do so by raising your hand through pressing *9 on your phone keypad. So with that, we'll go ahead and turn back to the questions coming in through the chat. Our next question is, at a couple different points, the clay soils in the Western DPS have been mentioned as unique to that portion of the range and an important factor in the determination of Unit 1 as the DPS. Is there any evidence to suggest that the soils in Unit 1 are significantly different than those in Unit 2? The Crawford et al. 2020 paper cited in the SSA actually show a nearly identical relationship between soil drainage and modeled habitat suitability in these two units. Nor do these regions appear to be unique in this relationship relative to the other modeled ecoregions. In fact, SFL seemed to be the only ecoregion for which soil drainage stood out as different than in other ecoregions. And we'll go ahead and turn that over to Melissa.
Thanks, Megan, and thanks, Neil. Yeah, so in the SSA, we did point out the difference in soils and kind of between units, and especially between units 1 and 2 and the remainder of the range, right? So those more clay type soils. And we noted that as an influence on the species in that gopher tortoise in those 2 units with those more clay soils tend to have a smaller clutch size, lower reproductive success, that kind of thing. So we thought about that as we looked at species status, species condition, those influences on the species. In thinking about whether an area is a distinct population segment, though, we need to meet the discrete portion and the significance portion. So discrete is that markedly separate based on biological or ecological or genetic or physical factors. So we looked at the physical separation and then the genetic separation for DPS. But in our Federal Register notice, we didn't rely on those ecological differences for DPS. But yeah, we did look at soils and think about how those influences go for tortoise.
Great, thank you so much, Melissa. All right. Our next question in the chat is, were potential increased temperature effects on hatchling sex ratios included in the models?
I'd be happy to answer this question. This is Brian Folt. We did not include a component in the model to account for hatchling sex ratios as a response to changing temperatures. We did this because gopher tortoises currently inhabit a very substantial latitudinal gradient in temperature conditions across the species range, with really warm nesting conditions in South Florida and cooler nesting conditions in northern parts of the species range. And there is some evidence that females have the ability to choose where they put their nest in order to create a relatively equal sex ratio of that nest. So for that reason, we did not model, we did not include climate warming effects on sex ratios of nesting tortoises. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Brian. We have another question here that you might be able to answer. The question is, while analyzing gopher tortoise populations, I think this is a typo, what the number of gopher tortoises considered as a minimum viable population. What was minimum number of acres considered for MVP? And we can actually go to Joe as well if you have something to add there.
I can start, and I'll just say that in the scenario analysis for the future conditions model, we assumed a minimum viable population size, or in the modeling term in the SSA, we called it a persistence probability threshold, a minimum number of tortoises for a population that we'd consider to be persisting to. We define that as involving 3 adult females, which may be given most, given some information about population structure, that might involve 3 adult females and 1 juvenile female, or assuming a 50-50 sex ratio, an overall population of 8 tortoises was what we basically consider to be the minimum population size of a persisting tortoise population into the future. So I'll comment on that, and then if somebody else wants to jump in about the minimum number of acres. Well, I'll just add that for the minimum number of acres, we didn't have a minimum number of acres, but for that future conditions analysis, we were mostly focused on the number of tortoises that were present at these future time frames after that analysis was done. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Brian. Joe, anything you wanted to add there?
I can add a little bit here. It's for the abundance question, or for the MVP question. So in the current condition, we looked at a high resilience condition as being those populations that included 250 or more adult tortoises, which aligns with the MVP that was identified in several gopher tortoise working groups. And those are the populations that we would expect to persist biologically through appropriate timeframes. Our moderate resilience condition would be populations that had between 51 and 249 gopher tortoises. And the low resilience condition would include less than 50 gopher tortoises. We can probably circle back a little bit with the person that asked this question. I don't have the chat up in front of me now to get at the acres question.
Great, thank you both. Our next question is, are there avenues for reconsideration of the species listing determination based on a regional basis, say for specific areas of Florida where gopher tortoises appear to be at high or higher risk of extinction? If so, what are the avenues? And we'll turn that over to Nicole.
Hi, thank you for this question. So we list species under the Endangered Species Act, and that could be a species, a subspecies, or a distinct population segment. So what Melissa went through during the presentation about the DPS, or distinct population segment policy. To get at your question, the part of the question about avenues for reconsideration based on a regional basis or specific areas. So one of those avenues is we can be petitioned by any member of the public to look to see if there's a distinct population segment in a particular area. And so there's a whole process for that, and that's available on our website. But if you needed to reach out to somebody specifically, I'm happy to provide that information to you.
Great, thank you, Nicole. And you may have already addressed this a little bit, but we have another question, which is, can different units other than the 5 defined units be proposed as potential DPSs?
Yeah, thank you for the question. As Joe alluded to in the presentation, those 5 analysis units in the SSA were delineated for the science portion, our species status assessment. So they weren't predefined units that would meet the distinct population segment policy. And so we could evaluate it potentially in different ways to see if something met the distinct population segment policy. So hopefully that answers your question.
Perfect. Thank you, Nicole. And we'll just wait and see if we have any more questions coming in through the chat, but I think for now we're mostly caught up. Again, the instructions to ask a question are up on the screen, and we'll be accepting questions for around another 10 minutes or so. Thank you. And we do just want to remind folks that if you have any additional questions or your question hasn't been answered thus far tonight, we encourage those to be submitted to the Gopher Tortoise email, and we'll provide that information shortly. And the next question, it is a little bit duplicative, but we'll go ahead and still try and answer it. The question is, being that private lands make up such a significant portion of the range, and because there is limited data from those areas due to privacy restrictions, and considering that the SSA has put some level of dependence on the fact that private lands hold persistent populations and habitat, regardless of the lack of dependable data, how would FWS react to or become aware of a massive loss of private lands conservation efforts? And we'll go ahead and turn that over to Leo.
That's a really great question, because not only we evaluate the status of the species across the landscape, regardless of where they are. In terms of the scientific data that we rely on, most of the data that we did use was from public lands, state and federal lands. So all the modeling, all the solid data came from those public lands. But however, we do know that private lands data is hard to come by, but we do know that those populations are still very resilient in many areas across the landscape on private lands. We have relied on data from different associations, NGOs, that provide that data to us. What I'm trying to say here is that private lands conservation is critical to the conservation of gopher tortoise and many other species. What is going on across the landscape, keeping those working lands working, is very important to the conservation of these species and many others that rely on the same habitats. Any other way to get that kind of data and respecting and protecting the private land owner data and private lands rights is really critical too. The landowners are providing really good stewardship to the land stewardship, protecting the species. So how can we get that data in a way that we can use it to make policy decisions will be critical into the future. All of that being said, I think that, as I said before, we have been very conservative in terms of the data that we've been using. we rely on data that is reliable on public lands, but we know that a lot more conservation is happening on those private lands. So that's something that I would love to explore even more. How do we get to compare apples and apples and not apples and oranges across the landscape? But in terms of the gopher tortoises, a lot is going on private lands. 86 to 90% of the lands in the Southeast United States are private. And that's where this species is having a stronghold. However, you know, we are relying on strong science, and whatever we can get from private lands, I would love to get even better data down the road. If things change, we will not hesitate to reassess these decisions. That's why we have the Endangered Species Act, which is probably the greatest conservation tool in the entire planet. And that's the beauty about it, is that if the science and the data change, we can reassess. So that I will encourage everybody here to provide the ways and ideas and feedback to get us that data, and through full transparency, evaluate that data and make sound policy decisions based on strong science. So thank you for that question. It's not an easy answer, but I think that we struggle with that, and we will continue to struggle on how to get the best science that we can use to make the best policy decisions for the conservation of the species and the habitats that they where they occur. So again, thank you for that question. I really appreciate it.
Great, thank you, Leo. And we do have one more question that was about recent hurricanes. And the Fish and Wildlife Service is going to follow up with this individual to make sure they're understanding the question correctly. But if Connor has something he'd like to add to that question, we can go ahead and turn it over to him. The question was, thousands were killed along the coast of Florida during the hurricane when miles of dunes disappeared with them into the ocean. There's zero movement by any agency to help. How does that not affect your decision? So Connor, do you have anything you'd like to add there?
Yeah, so I'm not a part of the decision team, and so I can't speak to the decision process itself and how it accounted for that kind of thing, but I can say that the predictive modeling that Brian led and I helped with did account for sea level rise effects on gopher tortoises along coastal habitats. So part of our predictive modeling and part of those scenarios included coastal habitat loss due to inundation from sea level rise, which storm surges are a part of that process. And most of those predictions came from, I believe, the NOAA predictive models for sea level rise in the region. And so while we know that these individual events are difficult to witness and tragic in a way, but our modeling did try to account for that in predicting the future status of the species.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. It looks like we have reached the end of our scheduled time tonight. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Leo for some closing remarks.
Thank you so much, everybody here, for participating. It has been a wonderful 2 hours. As I said at the beginning, I'm a big fan of gopher tortoises. I love them. I have them on my own property here in Georgia. And the level of engagement, I'm really happy about it from all of you, and very proud of that. I think that it gave me hope in terms of looking into the future, how people and the entire American public cares about the environment and the species and the habitats that they occur. So in closing, I would like to say thank you to all of you. Wonderful questions, great questions that show the conundrum that we are facing in light of climate change and species and habitat conservation. So one thing that I would like to say in closing here is that science is the driver. If conditions change, we can change too. So that's something that is critical. It's not a one-time done deal thing. So I will encourage everybody to keep engaging in all of this, conservation, species-specific things, Endangered Species Act process, and all of that. Science, please keep engaging. That's really important, not only for the Gopher Tortoise, but for the entire landscape and the well-being of the entire American public. So with that, I would like to close and say muchas gracias, buenas noches, and looking forward to the next conservation talk. Appreciate it. Thank you, everybody.